The village of Kayala Dund, forgotten in the untamed expanse, was eternally dark. Dense, rolling mist floated above its steep, uneven alleys, creeping like ghostly fingers around rotting wooden cabins. The silence was oppressive, punctuated by the faraway wails of unseen beasts and the wind, which whispered the voices no living mind should ever be privy to. Legend had it that there was an abyss beneath the village, a chasm so old and accursed that even the earth above it seethed with an evil presence. Most of those who chose to remain in Kala Dund for any period of time vanished into nothingness or drove themselves mad from listening to the voices from the abyss. No outsider came here by choice. No villager left by choice. But on this night, Ali Hyder had no choice. Ali Hyder wrapped his cloak more closely about him, his heart pounding as he stood in the entrance of the village. The rusty signpost, swinging drunkenly from a wooden stake, had the name Kala Dund painted in faded blood-red letters. Below it, an almost illegible inscription read, "Turn back while you still can." A chill ran down his spine. Behind him, his boyhood friends, Akmal, Fida, Aryan, Lukman, Yahya, Sawara, Bushra, Iman, Saba, and Safia, remained bunched up together, their faces wan in the pale moonlight. They had grown up listening to stories of Ka'ala Dund, a location where the dead would not lie down, and where the air was heavy with secrets of unseen terror. But they had to be here. Last week, Fida's younger sister, Amal, had gone missing on a trip with their uncle. Their uncle's corpse had been discovered along the border of the village. His eyes plucked out, his mouth contorted into a scream. Amal, though, was nowhere to be seen. The villagers had warned them. If she was swallowed by the abyss, she is already lost. But Fida would not believe it. Now they stood before the abandoned village, the burden of their choice weighing upon them. "Are you certain?" Aryan's voice was little more than a whisper. "We have no choice," Fida said, his knuckles white from holding the hilt of the dagger at his side. "We must locate Amal." No one protested, but a silent fear settled over them as they stepped beyond the sign, into the haunted village. Kala Dund was not like anything they had ever dreamed. The buildings were slanted inward, cowering before some hidden horror. Windows were broken, doors swung free on rusted hinges, and the stench of wet rot filled the air. Strange symbols lined the streets, carved into the stone with what appeared to be dried blood. No hint of life, no laughter, no movement, just the whispers. At first, they were soft, like the whispering of a stream in the distance. But as the group moved further into the village, the whispers became louder, disembodied cries calling their names, telling them to depart. Saba halted suddenly. "Did you hear that?" she panted. The group froze. The voice had been unmistakable, a child's voice, distant and shaking, crying for aid. "Amal!" Fida rushed forward, his eyes desperate. "Wait!" Akmal charged after him, but Fida had already vanished into the mist, his footsteps engulfed by the creepy quiet. A split second later, his shriek ripped through the air. They sprinted towards the noise, gasping and their fear racing. They arrived at the village square to see Fida standing at the rim of an ancient well, his face pale. His trembling hand gestured down. She's down there." His voice broke. The group gazed into the open black emptiness of the well. The air that welled up from inside was abnormally chilly, bearing a noxious smell of rot and something much worse, something living. Then they saw her, Amal. She was leaning deep in the well, her white hands wrapped around the worn stone walls, her dark hair covering her face. Her gown was ripped and dirty, but it was the way she moved that ran cold through their blood. She was rocking back and forth, her body rigid, her head at an odd angle. And then she started to whisper. At first it was soft, incoherent. But as they strained to hear, her words became distinct. "It knows you're here. It won't let you leave." Bushra emitted a choked sob. Something's wrong with her. We have to get her out. No, a voice rasped behind them. The group turned around. There was an old man standing there, his face stretched taut over his skull, his eyes deep and sunken. He smelled of wet earth, and his clothes seemed not to have been washed in decades. You shouldn't have come, he whispered, his voice breaking. The abyss has already taken her. She's alive, Fida screamed. We can save her. The old man shook his head. She may appear alive, but that is not your sister anymore. Fida spun back toward the well. Amal was still swaying. But now, she was slowly tilting her head upward, well beyond the bounds of normal human movement. Her face was off. Her skin was too tight, pulled back over her skull. Her eyes dark holes sunk deep. Her mouth was too wide, twisted into a macabre grin. And then she spoke once more, her voice no longer hers. You should not have come. A burst of energy hit them, sending them stumbling backward. The earth shook, and out of the well, a thick black cloud of mist started to rise, twisting and writhing like living vines. The whispers became screams, scores of voices shrieking in pain, begging to be let go. Ali Hyder seized Fida, dragging him back from the precipice. We have to leave, immediately. But the mist was moving quickly, curling around their ankles, tugging them towards the well. The old man recoiled backward, his eyes distorted with fear. It's awake. The abyss is awake. A throaty, unnatural growl resounded from the depths of the well, trembling the earth below them. And then something stirred in the darkness below. Something that wasn't Amal. The shock hit them collectively. Amal had never brought them here. The abyss had, and it was hungry. The village of Kaladund creaked beneath their feet, as if the land itself was awakening from a fitful ancient sleep. Ali Hyder took hold of Fida's arm and yanked him back from the edge of the well as the black cloud stirred and billowed, rising like a living thing. The whispers became screams, reverberating in a language they couldn't comprehend, voices clamoring, pleading, warning, and crying simultaneously. Nothing, though, was more terrifying than Amal's distorted figure dangling in the well, her monstrous smile getting broader. Fida fought Ali Hyder's hold. Let me go. She's still alive. No, she's not. Bushra sobbed, crying openly. The old man, the one who'd warned them, took a step back, his sunken eyes with something beyond fear. Resignation. We must go, the old man breathed. Before it... A wet, sickening sound hung in the air. The old man's body spasmed violently as an invisible hand closed around his throat. His feet left the floor, his wrinkled fingers grasping at nothing anyone could perceive. His mouth was stretched in a silent scream, bulging eyes, and then, crack! His neck snapped sharply to the side, breaking with a sound that threw a wave of nausea over the group. His dead body flopped to the ground. A cold, warped laughter echoed up from inside the well. More! More! Run! Ali Hyder shrieked, but it was already too late. The black haze spewed out of the well, coiling through the air like a huge, twisting snake. It moved abnormally quickly, firing towards them in strands of moving darkness. Sayawara let out a screaming shriek when one of the tendrils grasped around her ankle and pulled her from her feet. She scrabbled at the earth and gravel grinding under her fingernails as she tried to stay upright. "Help me," she screamed. Akmal moved forward, capturing her wrist when the mist started to drag on her. His muscles bunched, veins pulsating on his arms as he battled the unseeable power. But the mist was more powerful. Sawara's body was sinking into the earth as if swallowed. Her eyes were bulging in stark fear. "Don't let go," she wailed. The mist constricted her leg, and then, with a deafening crack, her bone broke. Her scream sliced the darkness. Akmal tumbled backward as her body was pulled down, her hands, her arms, her face disappearing into the soil. and she was gone. No trace, no corpse, just the heavy hush that came after. A hush that was shattered by a slow, wet gurgle. They moved towards the well. Amal, or whatever was using her skin, was crawling up the sides of the well. Her arms were twisted at the wrong angle, her fingers digging into the stone with fingernails now transformed into jagged, blackened claws. And her eyes, those which had once been so full of childhood innocence, were now black voids, reaching out infinitely into darkness. She was not alone. From the well, hundreds of hands reached out, scratching at the stone, their bony fingers covered in black sludge. The abyss had awakened. "Go! Now!" Lukman bellowed. The group dispersed, running through the deserted village, their footsteps clattering against the ruined walls. Ali Hyder could hear the squelching of the fog, the scuttling of abnormally formed limbs, and the whispers of the dead pursuing them. He yanked Emin's hand, propelling her ahead as she stumbled. "Where do we go?" she shrieked. Fida's breathing was harsh, his sweat and tear-drenched face flushed. "We must leave the village." "But the fog." Bushra's voice cut off in her throat as a figure sprang out of the shadows. Something not human. Once it had been human, but now it was only skin clinging to jutting bones, its mouth torn apart at the seams, revealing bloody, jagged rows of putrid teeth. It moved on all fours toward them, its head jerking with unnatural haste. "Join us." It spoke in a voice that did not belong to it. The group ran the other way. But more of them were emerging from the shadows, dozens of figures, all in various states of decay. Some missing limbs, others with faces twisted into frozen screams. They were surrounded, and behind them, the well continued to vomit forth the abyss. Safiya suddenly grabbed Ali Hyder's arm. Her eyes were wide with realization. "The shrine," she gasped. Aryan's head snapped toward her. "What?" "Shrine on the outskirts of the village. The elders used to say it was constructed to seal something in." Ali Hyder's heart raced. If the shrine was constructed to seal the abyss, then perhaps, just perhaps, it was their only hope. "We have to go there," he said. The group turned, making a dash for the opposite end of the village where the ancient shrine was concealed. The whispers increased. The ground below them started cracking. The abyss was not going to release them. The ground below their feet shook harshly, opening up with deep, sharp cracks as the abyss swallowed Kala Dund. Ali Hyder, Fida, Bushra, Aryan, Lukman, Yahya, Eamon, Saba, and Safiya ran with all their might, the shrine being their sole salvation. Behind them, hellish creatures, distorted forms of the dead, their faces contorted in screams, chased without any respite. The murmurs were now shrieks, a deafening bellow to shake bones, words laced with venom. "You cannot flee." Bushra tripped, hardly managing to prevent herself from plunging into the open crater that had formed in the ground. Something churned below ground level, something huge. "Keep going!" Ali Hyder yelled, grasping her wrist and propelling her forward. Before her, through the fog, the shrine finally became visible. It stood old and decaying, constructed of black stone, its surface inscribed with strange symbols. It was not like any mosque, temple, or place of worship they had ever encountered. A building older than time itself. But as they approached, a sudden blast hit them, throwing them to the ground. The air grew heavy and oppressive, as if something intangible was crushing their chests. And then it moved forward. From the fog, a figure formed. It wasn't like any of the other gruesome things that had crawled up out of the chasm. This one was worse. It stood tall and gaunt, cloaked in rotting robes that had previously adorned a priest or elder. But its face was nothing short of a gaping void, a bottomless black hole in which eyes never should have resided. In its clawed, bony fingers, it grasped an ancient staff, its tip pulsating with a red light. It did not say a word, but they heard its voice in their minds. You should not have come here. A wave of paralyzing terror seized them. Emin stumbled, struggling for air as the world around her grew dark. Yahya flailed at his throat, his own darkness creeping up off the ground to coil around his frame. Fida shrieked, waving her finger at the shrine. We need to get in there, now! Gathering every last bit of strength, Ali Hyder plunged forward, pulling Eamon with him. The others joined in, tumbling over shattered stone as they stumbled toward the entrance of the shrine. The gatekeeper raised its staff. The earth trembled wildly, and the shrine's great doors started to shut. "Go!" Saba yelled, shoving Safiya inside and then dashing in after her. Ali Hyder flung himself over the door just as the great stone doors crashed shut behind him. Boom! There was a deadly silence within the shrine. They were trapped in. But the darkness was full of life. And something waited for them. The air within the shrine was heavy, not only with dust, but with an ancient, stifling presence. The stone walls, etched with macabre carvings, throbbed faintly beneath the faint light from their phones. Ali Hyder's breathing was harsh as he faced the others. 8 of them were left: Fida, Bushra, Aryan, Lukman, Yahya, Eman, Saba, and Safiya. They had managed to escape the terrors outside by mere chance, but within this accursed shrine, something was observing them. The doors behind them had closed, sealing them in from the world outside. There was no going back. We made it," Saba breathed, her face against the chill stone wall. Her words trembled, but as soon as she had spoken them, a low, rasping whisper filled the shrine. "No, you did not." The voice was everywhere and nowhere, an old presence that had been here long before they were. A creeping, horrible realization dawned on them. They were not alone. Fida held up his phone's flashlight, scanning the walls of the shrine. The carvings were horrific. They showed figures on their knees in prayer, hands upraised to something looming and monstrous, with empty eyes and an open maw that devoured all light. And in the middle of the shrine stood a stone altar, dark-stained with something long dried. What is here?" Bushra breathed, wrapping her arms around herself. Lukman swallowed hard. "I think this is where the elders offered their sacrifices." Aryan spun around sharply. "Sacrifices?" Lukman nodded seriously, his finger pointed at a carved passage in the stone. "Look." The old writing was unfamiliar, but some of it had been translated into Urdu, probably by someone who'd come here before. "To prevent the abyss from rising, we need to feed it blood. The firstborn, the innocent, a sacrifice for all eternity." A weighty silence descended upon them. "The elders, they were feeding it?" Iman breathed, appalled. Safiya went white. "That means it's still hungry." The air cooled as if the shrine itself had accepted her words. A groaning, tortured creak reverberated through the chamber. The shrine was stirring. An impromptu burst of wind rushed through the room, despite there being no windows or vents. The wall torches sprang to life, their light dancing across the walls in macabre shadows. Then, the whispers resumed. "One must stay." The words seeped into the air, coiling about them like ice-cold fingers. Bushra gasped as her feet became airborne. Something invisible was levitating her. "No, no, help me!" she shrieked, her body lifting higher, her arms and legs flailing. Ali Hyder rushed forward, grabbing her ankle, attempting to drag her back down, but it was stronger. Bushra's back went into an unnatural arch, her mouth opening into a silent scream as her body twisted. And then, crack! Her spine broke in two. Her dead body crumpled onto the floor, her face etched in horror. The shrine claimed its first offering. A black, viscous liquid oozed from the cracks in the altar, crawling towards Bushra's body. The whispers swelled. More, more, more. The shrine was not appeased. Saba shook her head, weeping wildly, while Yahya whispered prayers into the silence. Ali Hyder caught Fida's arm. "We can't remain here, we must find another exit." Fida's gaze was still glued to Bushra's shattered body. I don't believe there is one." But as he was speaking, Safiya saw something. A door. It was set into the farthest wall, barely visible under the flickering torchlight. Unlike the rest of the shrine's stone surfaces, this door was constructed of old, decaying wood, as if it had been an afterthought. And unlike the rest of the shrine, it was a little ajar. A slow, cold wind leaked through the crack. "This wasn't in the village records," Luqman whispered. Ali Hyder moved carefully, each step like a weight pulling him in as if something at the other end was drawing him towards it. His hand shook as he forced it open. Across the door was a long, coiling staircase, down into complete darkness. "We're not going down there," Ayman said definitely. "We have no other choice," Ali Hyder replied. "Whatever is in this shrine desires us dead. Remaining here means we die." They looked at each other one by one, paralyzed by fear. But what else could they do? They went down. The farther down they descended, the colder it grew. The stone stairs creaked under their feet, as if protesting and warning them to retreat. Then they started hearing it. A deep, rasping breathing, not from one creature, from several. Saba gripped Luqman's arm. "Something's down there." Ali Hyder swallowed. "I know." The breathing sounded louder, and then they arrived at the bottom. The cavern in front of them was enormous and was lined with scores of bones. And at the very center, a pit, a chasm in the earth, its rim burned black as if by fire. It was not possible to measure its depth, but there was movement within. Something old, something hungry. The whispers now were a screaming cacophony of 1,000 voices. Luqman crept forward, looking into the pit. "This is it. The abyss," Aryan breathed. They had heard the stories, the place forbidden underneath Kayala-Dund, where something monstrous had been imprisoned ages ago. But now, the seals were shattering. The earth shook beneath their feet, and suddenly, a giant hand burst forth from the pit, its fingers distorted and blackened, its nails long and razor-sharp like knives. It clutched the floor, hauling itself upward. A head appeared, with empty eyes seeping darkness. Its mouth yawned open, showing rows of pointed inhuman teeth. The abyss was no longer contained. It was stirring. The enormous burned hand clasped the lip of the pit, its fingernails corroded daggers that scratched the stone. The low, throaty growl sounded from deep within, something not made by any living creature. Ali Hyder and the others stepped back, their eyes wide with terror as the gruesome head came out further. Its empty, blood-filled sockets appeared to look right through them, sucking in their fear. "We have to get out of here," Fida breathed, grabbing Saba by the arm. "But where?" Aryan screamed. "The passage back is blocked." The stone stairs shook behind them, developing cracks as if the shrine itself was disintegrating. The murmurs in the room grew louder, turning into words that froze their souls. "You cannot escape." And then, the void bellowed. A wave of air and darkness exploded out of the pit, sending them all crashing to the floor. 1,000 phantom hands thrust from the depths, their bony fingers flailing blindly, grasping for something to drag into the depths. Yahya pulled Iman back before the void could consume her completely. "We need to find another way." "There is no other way," Luqman panted, his voice cracking. But Safiya wasn't hearing. Her gaze was fixed on something close to the opposite wall of the room. A second door. It was smaller than the first, hidden behind a pile of broken bones and debris. It looked ancient, covered in strange markings, almost as if someone had sealed it long ago. The elders tried to hide this, she realized. This is what they didn't want anyone to find. Ali Hyder didn't hesitate. Then that's where we're going. He and Fida pushed in front, clearing away the bones while the others fought to follow them. Behind them, the void screamed another deafening cry, the phantom hands reaching out. Saba shrieked out an ear-splitting scream as one of the hands closed around her ankle. No! She fought furiously, her nails raking into the stone as she attempted to tear free. Aryan leaped, grabbing her wrists and pulling her close. The bone-white fingers ripped at her skin, but with one last desperate tug, she was loose. They staggered through the secret door, slamming it in their faces just as the abyss's hands raked at the frame. A ghastly screeching noise echoed. But then, silence. The abyss had ceased, for now. The passageway past the door was cramped and suffocatingly dark. It stank of rot, of damp ground, and something off. Lukman ignited a small torch on the wall, the fire dying off feebly. The walls in this place were changed, no longer blocks of solid stone, but rough, jagged bricks, as if the passage had been constructed in secret, somewhere apart from the shrine. "What is this?" Emin breathed. No one knew. They pushed deeper, the tunnel curving and constricting, as if to take them deeper into the guts of the planet. The air was heavy, choking, dense with something that wasn't visible. Then they saw it. A huge doorway, unlike any they had seen before. It was made of black stone, the surface scored with symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light of the torches. The symbols were not human, and in the center, a pair of bloody handprints. Big. Too big to be from any of them. "Someone was here before us," Fida whispered, his fingers tracing the dried blood. "Not someone," Sophia said. "Something." Ali Hyder let out a sharp breath. "We have two options. We go through this door, or we turn back and confront the abyss." Nobody wanted to confront the abyss again. Ali Hyder pressed his palms against the cold, dark stone slowly, hesitantly. The instant he did, the symbols burst into flame, and the door creaked open by itself. Beyond it lay a round room, and in its center, a lone stone table. Not only a table, an altar. A book lay open upon it, its pages yellowed with age and cracking. The writing was in an unknown script, but some of the symbols were the same as those in the shrine. Lukman stepped forward, breathing shallowly. He ran his fingers over the first line, whispering as he attempted to read it aloud. And then, his voice stopped. His eyes widened with horror. "What does it say?" Yahya asked, drawing closer. Lukman's voice trembled as he translated. "To still the abyss, one must be given. A willing heart, a willing soul. Blood must be given, freely." There was a crushing, heavy silence that descended on them. It was the secret the elders never wanted discovered. They hadn't merely been offering innocence to the abyss as a sacrifice. They'd been selecting a person to be killed, someone who would willingly offer themselves for the others in return. And now, that decision was up to them. "No," Saba whispered, her head jerking back and forth. No, we're not doing this. We're not killing anyone." "But if we don't," Eamon said softly, "the abyss won't quit." The force of her words smote them all. Perhaps we can do something else," Aryan ventured, his tone on the verge of pleading. "We don't know if this is real. Perhaps it's a trap. Or perhaps it's the only thing we can do," Fida grumbled. The altar throbbed, seemed to be alive, waiting. Then, a great, throaty growl shook the chamber. The abyss was approaching. Something huge hit the secret door, and dust and stone poured down over them. A second blow, a third. It wouldn't last long. Time was running out. They had to choose. Ali Hyder looked at them, his face white and grim. "One of us has to do it." No one said a word. No one wanted to die. But if nobody volunteered, they all would. Another earthquake-like blow on the door. The abyss was breaching, The whispers crowded the chamber, intensifying, distorting into something harsh and sneering. "You must choose." Lukman breathed deeply. His gaze met Ali Hyder's, and he was calm for the first time. "I'll do it," Saba hissed. "No, you can't." "I have to." Lukman smiled weakly. "If we don't end this here, it'll never stop." Before anyone could inhibit him, he moved towards the altar. A blast of unnatural wind ripped through the room, as if something approved of his choice. He grasped the ancient ritual knife, its blade darkened with age and previous sacrifices. Then, with a final gasp, he drove it into his own chest. Lukman's body fell across the altar, his blood spreading into the fissures of the ancient stone. A low, thrumming hum shook the chamber, as if the walls themselves were thirsting on his offering. The whispers that had pursued them from the depths of the abyss ceased. A thick, unnatural, and crushing silence fell about them. Ali Hyder's hands shook as he advanced. It worked, or at least they believed. Then the torch's flames danced wildly, casting long, writhing shadows on the chamber. The air became intolerably cold. And then, Lukman's eyes flew open. Saba gasped in a strangled breath, stumbling back as Lukman's body convulsed abnormally. His lips opened, but the voice that issued wasn't his. Not enough. His voice was warped, layered, as if 1,000 voices spoke through him. His fingers clasped the altar, his fingernails sinking deep into the stone. The blood on the surface started to churn, spewing a dark, heavy mist that coiled around them like living things. Fita's breathing was light. He was supposed to. Lukman's head whipped toward them, and they saw for the first time what had possessed him. His eyes were empty voids, churning with shadows and faces, as if something had burrowed into his soul and claimed it as its own. "We must run," Aryan breathed. But Lukman moved with a speed no human ought to have, his body jolting forward with unnatural velocity. His fingers reached out, wrapping around Saba's throat. She screamed a strangled scream as her feet left the floor, her body hoisted by an unseen hand. "It requires more," Lukman's twisted voice whispered, his hand clenching. One was never sufficient. Ali Hyder reacted instinctively. He struck at Lukman, pushing him back from Saba. They both fell to the ground, but Lukman's body contorted in a way that was impossible, bones twisting where they shouldn't. Then his mouth stretched wide out of all proportion. A sickening, tortured wail burst from him, no longer merely a scream, but a cacophony of pain. The chamber walls shook, and the glyphs on the altar blazed deep red. The shrine was waking. "We must leave," Yahya cried out. "But where?" Eamon wailed, her face streaked with tears. And then they saw it. A secret passage, long sealed behind the altar, had started to creak apart, revealing a staircase of stone steps leading downwards. A journey into the abyss. "There's nowhere else." Ali Hyder groaned, clutching at his injured side. "We go down." "But," Fita faltered. "Go!" They poured into the passage, the darkness engulfing them. Behind them, Lukman's grotesquely deformed body arched as he emitted another unhuman scream. And then, the door shut behind them with a crash. The way down was steep, the stairs slippery and uneven, as though centuries had passed since they were last touched. The air cooled, and the feeling of being observed increased with each step. Saba was still panting, her fingers quivering against her bruised throat. He wasn't supposed to return. "We were mistaken about all of it," Aryan grunted. And then the tunnel gave way to a gigantic underground cave. The ground was covered with hundreds of skeletal bodies, some smashed, some still holding rusted swords, as if they had been killed in battle against something invisible. But the worst was the carvings on the walls. They weren't simply ancient symbols. They were stories. Stories of how each generation, a new offering had been given. Of how the abyss was never really quieted. Of how it always craved more. And at the center of it all, a great charred throne. Ali Hyder moved slowly, uncertainly toward the throne, his breast constricting in horror. This is where it all started. The chair was carved out of obsidian, but the symbols on it were fresh, as though someone, or something, had only just disturbed them. And then, the earth convulsed with a mighty shudder. A great hollow gasp filled the cave. It was not human. Something was present, something that had waited. Then the whispers came again. But this time, they were no longer at a distance. They were within their minds. Bushra buried her hands in her ears, tears streaming down her face. "Make it stop. Make it stop." "It won't stop," Vida breathed, his words shattered. "It never stops." And they saw it, a figure sitting on the throne, not a corpse, not a ghost, but something between. It wore tattered robes, its face obscured by a veil of shadows. Its hands were bony, but they still moved, slowly, slowly, as if they remembered how to be alive. And then, the figure spoke. "You think you can end this?" Its voice was not one, but many. "You cannot silence what was never meant to rest." The cavern trembled with violence, dust and bones falling from the ceiling. The figure started to rise, and the throne dissolved to ash. Ali Hyder's breath was caught in his throat. The abyss itself had taken shape, and it was hungry. The cavern shook as the creature on the throne stood at full height. It was overpowering, an emptiness of black that had seemed to vacuum out their lights from the torches. Air between them thinned to heavy, rotten corpse cold, and the moaning which had pursued them so tortured their minds. Ali Hyder felt his legs give, his own breathing stuck in his throat. This was no ghost. This was something old, something that had lain in wait in the depths of hell for centuries, surviving on the fear and blood of the living. And now, it had come alive. You... Vida attempted to speak, but was overwhelmed by the creature's screaming, echoing laughter. "You seek peace, yet you have brought only despair." The darkness coiled around them, stretching like inky tendrils, moving like a living nightmare. And then, the floor cracked open. A great pit yawned beneath them, lined with countless writhing hands, human hands, clawing from the abyss below, their flesh twisted and rotten, their nails bloody and broken from centuries of trying to climb free. Saba screamed out in a sob as the hands grasped for her, their fingers tracing along her ankles, attempting to drag her in. Ali Hyder leapt forward, catching her just as her foot went over the edge. He yanked her back, and they both fell to the ground, pounding hearts. The being on the throne observed them, its empty eyes churning with malice. One sacrifice was not enough. The voices howled in agreement, a harmony of the condemned. The abyss needs to feed. The entity lifted its arm, and shadows around them materialized. Off the walls, off the earth, off the darkness itself, figures coalesced. Ragged husks of the long dead, the souls doomed forever to roam the abyss, now summoned to answer its master's call. And at their lead, Lukman, or what remained of him. His body was contorted, his limbs jerking awry, his head hanging to one side. But his eyes, black, bottomless pits, were fixed on them. "Run." The command was a mere breath, but it was sufficient. Ali Hyder took Saba's hand, and they ran together. They ran through the cavern, their torches dancing wildly, casting only fitful light down the endless corridors before them. The walls of stone seemed to shift around them, curving into impossible shapes, as if the abyss itself were alive, changing, evolving, holding them in its grasp. Behind them, the shadows screamed. The creatures of the abyss chased after them, their deformed bodies scraping against the walls, their breath cold as ice on the back of their necks. Fida fell, almost hit the ground, but Aryan caught him. "Move! Move! There must be a way out!" Yahya bellowed, his voice raw. But before them, only darkness, and the chasm was closing. The whispers resurfaced, this time inside their heads, telling them to quit, to yield, to get on their knees and kiss the abyss goodbye. "You are already dead. You belong to us. Your one of you must give yourself, or all will be seized." Ali Hyder ground his teeth, trying to drown them out. Then, unexpectedly, a doorway appeared before him, a colossal rusted gate, overgrown with symbols of ancient provenance, emanating a profound crimson glow. Behind it, a solitary altar, and an enormous book lying open, its pages turning as if scripted by unseen fingers. "The ultimate ritual," Aryan whispered. "We must complete what was initiated." The pages of the book whispered, the letters changing, reforming themselves into something readable. They were commands. A method to close the void. A method to trap the thing forever. A method to stop this. But the cost was apparent. One of them had to remain. One of them had to become the keeper of the abyss, to take the entity's place, to ensnare the darkness with their own essence. The abyss needed a final sacrifice. Saba's breath caught. We can't." But before anyone could prevent him, Ali Hyder moved forward. "No!" Saba shouted, clapping his hand over Ali Hyder's arm. "There has to be another way." Ali Hyder shook his head. "There isn't." The creatures were moving in. Lukman's shattered voice boomed across the abyss. "It was always supposed to be this way." Ali Hyder faced the book, his hands shaking as he started speaking the words. The altar erupted into flame, the symbols red with fire, the abyss roaring in rage. The throne of darkness broke. The creature gave a scream of blood, its form starting to disintegrate, its strength being pulled from it into the altar. The abyss was sealing, but Ali Hyder was not able to leave. Saba wept, stretching out to him, but something held her back. The others pulled her away, their hearts shattering as the portal to the abyss started to close. Ali Hyder looked back at them for the last time. He smiled. And then, the door slammed shut. The survivors emerged from the temple, gasping, falling onto the ground. The sky above was blue. The air was quiet. The whispers were silenced. The curse was lifted. But Ali Hyder was gone with it. The abyss had claimed its last sacrifice, and the world would never know his name. Years went by. The village stayed empty, abandoned, reclaimed by the forest. No one was brave enough to go back. But sometimes, on the windless nights, if one listened carefully, a whisper could still be heard, faint, calling, waiting, because the abyss never really goes away. It only waits for the next voice to respond. If this tale of terror sent shivers down your spine, let me know by hitting that like button, leaving a comment and sharing with friends who crave a good scare. Don't forget to subscribe for more hair-raising stories and hit the notification bell to stay in the loop of all things eerie. Until next time, remember, the unknown is closer than you think. Sleep well if you can.